All right, today we're going to be talking about Darwin's theory of evolution. So, essential questions of the day. What evidence convinced Darwin that species could change over time? What are the four principles of natural selection? And how can natural selection change a population? All right, so let's talk about our vocabulary. I've talked about selective breeding already when I talked about changing wolves into dogs and how we ended up with Chihuahuas and all the different dog breeds, but we'll talk more about that today. New vocabulary, we're going to talk about artificial selection, which selective breeding is one of those, natural selection, and evolution. All right, so let's talk about Darwin. Darwin, he did his iconic journey back in the time when people thought that the world was around 6,000 years old. He went as a naturalist, as a biologist. His job was to collect biological and geographic data, collect specimens, and document. That was his sole purpose on this journey. He started out in Spain. He went down past the coast of South America. On the coast of South America, this is where he found the Galapagos Islands. This was the biggest discovery. This is where he forms his theory of natural selection. Then he travels around, all skirting down here past Australia, Africa, and then on back up to Spain. So, what he found on the Galapagos Islands, he found four different species, um, four different types of species. He noticed that the mainland species were different than the species on the islands. And he noticed that he could tell which island certain species came from based upon their physiology, so based upon their physical makeup. He focused in on the tortoises, the finches, the iguanas, and the red mangrove. So with the tortoises, the two that he really talks about, there was one that had a saddle-shaped shell, and this allowed it to reach its head up and neck up higher, so it could reach the food source, which was higher. And then there was one that had a dome-shaped shell. That's the one that's on the picture there. And he cannot reach his head up as high, but the food source on that island is lower, so he doesn't need to reach his head up as high. The finches, based upon the food source, there were different beak sizes for the finches. So some had very large beaks because they had very large and hard nuts that they had to crack. The ones that had to get into smaller spaces to get the smaller food had really small and thin beaks, so on and so forth. With the iguanas, we end up with the one and only species of marine iguanas in the world because their food source is in the water, so they adapted to be able to go into the water to get food. I don't know a whole lot about the red mangrove because animals are more interesting than plants. All right, so big takeaway from Darwin. He noticed that the island species were slightly different with slight variations from the mainland species. That's the big takeaway. And these slight variations were based upon what was necessary to survive on those islands, food wise and predator wise. Okay. If you don't take anything away, that's what you need to take away. Mainland species were slightly different than the island species based upon food source and predators. Okay? All right, so Darwin had already seen the whole thing going on with the dogs, wolf to dog. They already knew about artificial selection. They knew they were doing this. So he theorized, or he hypothesized, not theorized, he hypothesized that nature could do this on a much more gradual scale uh, and have it picking for certain traits, and it'd be very gradual and very slow changes, not as fast as an artificial selection would be where you're actively working for a goal. So he came up with the idea of natural selection. This is where you're going to have some type of competition. Something's going to happen where each individual does not have an equal chance of surviving. Some of the individuals are not as well equipped, So they don't have as good of a chance of surviving because they don't have the traits that allow for complete success in survival. So he had 5 principles. The individuals have to show variation. That means that they cannot all be exactly the same. If they're all exactly the same, there's not going to be any selection. If something comes through that can wipe out one, it can wipe out all. The variation has to be hereditable. So it must be passed on generation to generation. It can't be like, I dyed my hair blue and now I can survive better. If I dye my hair blue and I have a child, my child will not have blue hair because that is not in my genes. That is something that I just altered on myself. If someone has plastic surgery, they will not pass on their new features to their children. They'll pass on what's in the genetics. So all of the variation has to be in the genetics. There have to be more offspring born than can actually survive. If there's enough food, enough resources, there's no predators, and everyone can survive, there won't be any type of selective pressures because there's enough room for everybody and everyone will have an equal chance of survival. And the variations that increase reproductive success will be more common in the next generation. So an example of this is if I go out to the Arctic and we have our bunnies with the lynx and I have a bunch of white bunnies and I have a few brown bunnies. Well, the brown bunnies are going to be less adept at surviving there because they can be seen. A big brown dot on all of the expansive white snow, the lynx can see that very easily. So the lynx will eat the brown bunny. The next generation will not have brown bunnies because the brown bunnies will have been eaten and there's none left. Hope that makes sense. All right, this is a video. I'm going to post this on Canvas. You can click on it and watch it. It explains what I was talking about. I think it also uses some kind of archaic bunnies. All right, so Darwin went on his journey. He came up with all of his hypotheses. He showed evidence for it, and he ended up publishing The Origin of Species. If you notice, the date on there is way after his journey. There was actually another gentleman who published before him, which pushed Darwin to actually publish The Origin of Species. He did not want to publish it because it was a revolutionary idea, and he did not honestly want to deal with the backlash of it. But once the other person had published, he felt the need to claim his work. So because he took such meticulous notes, because he had everything dated, everything properly done, he was able to get the recognition for his work. So one key thing to remember on this: natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Evolution is going to be the change in a group of organisms over time. So if I look in the human population and I look in a city and there's so many people with blue eyes, and then I look 2 generations later and there's an increase in the number of people with blue eyes, that is what is called evolution. We had an evolution in the allele frequency of blue eyes. Natural selection could have been that people found that more attractive and they chose people with blue eyes to reproduce with. So natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. It is not evolution. All right, so artificial selection, that is where humans are going to choose the traits and push the evolution of a species. Natural selection is going to be where nature is going to push the evolution of a species based upon the selective pressures. All right, if you have questions, go to the discussion board area, play it again if you need to get better notes on it. And I will see you guys next class period.